History has been rewritten, as it so often is, and it may be for future generations to like rediscover this, what we call here, the hidden history of this period, the unheard music, as X called it in their song, the unheard music. The great contribution, the triumph of this thing we call the New Wave, was this incredible, diverse outpouring of songs and styles and ideas in which Blondie was so different from Pere Ubu, who were so different from the Buzzcocks, who were so different from the Dills, who were so different from you name it. The New Wave, it opened the door to a horde of people, some of them completely without talent, some of them strikingly and superbly talented, to express themselves as performers, as actors on the public stage, so to speak, in a way that they had never dreamed possible until they saw the Ramones play in a bar, or they saw a picture of Richard Hell in a torn T-shirt and shades and hair that looked like it hadn't been washed in a month, and you know what I mean? It was like all of a sudden it was like, wow. You don't have to have Keith Emerson's wardrobe, entourage, or personal wealth to make rock and roll. To get out there and find, to make a statement, to connect with an audience, to find an audience. This is a profound seismic shift in the lay of the land, so to speak, in American music. You could say that the aesthetics of the New Wave, even as broadly based as you might define it, would still have come as a shock, certainly to the ears of many radio programmers and probably to a large part of the audiences of those radio stations. There's just an aesthetic gap there between that and your average radio playlist of 1977, heavily weighted towards Ted Nugent, the Eagles, Kansas, REO Speedwagon, Elton John, and the like. So the aesthetic gap is one aspect of it. People, that is, people with the power to determine what records get played on the radio, holding their ears when they heard that stuff. Nobody in a major label seemed to, care a whit about, Pylon from Athens, Georgia, or the Dills from San Francisco. But New York rocker, those were like major bands. Those were considered like really happening bands. And that was for aesthetic reasons. That's because people went to see those bands or heard their indie records and were impressed and said, this group really has something distinctive, original, fresh, and exciting to offer. Nobody was waiting for Columbia Records to give its imprimatur, to the Dills to say, that this is okay for mass consumption. Everybody just said, this is our thing, in this period, those years in the late 70s, there's very few occasions for me to go to a major concert at a Madison Square Garden. Maybe to see Springsteen, maybe to see Neil Young. I hardly remember any others. But I can't even remember the number of shows I might have seen at Max's or CBGB. Not to mention all these other clubs that now forgotten, become restaurants, condos, whatever, parking lots. Tier 3 was one. The Old Tramps on East 15th Street. Hurrah on West 62nd. Danceteria, the Peppermint Lounge. These were all, and even more obscure places. There was like a dank basement at 1 Morton Street where I went to see a couple of shows that were pretty unforgettable. Well, I do think that that a lot of these musicians and the people involved in ancillary activities like my magazine, New York Rocker, that they were vomiting up the dominant culture, that they were, kind of shoving something back in somebody else's face, that they felt that they were being something that they felt that they were being force-fed through the mass media, particularly through radio, which had become increasingly plastic, constricted, and repetitive in its playlists, regardless of whatever format you're talking about. And it really was their own sound. It really was. It really didn't sound like, I'm not saying it had no precedent or influences. It had influences. But something like the first Ramones album it was just like a bolt of light. It was like a bolt from the blue for many people. I know it was for me. Very powerful, very powerful. In its brevity, concision or conciseness, humor, the inherent wit behind the songs, and this pervasive sense that they had actually created a model that anyone could make their own. Not that we needed a nation of 10,000 Ramones clones bands, but the idea that four, schlemiels from Queens had picked up these instruments and through like a relentless, grueling process of trial and error and rehearsals and sleeping on floors and, listening to records and so forth, that they had hammered out something that was really their own and that was as exciting to you, the listener, the consumer, the fan, as anything that was coming from Atlantic Records that week. This just goes to show you that, as in previous generations of rock and roll, really the spirit and the idea are of the greatest and essential importance. Technique is going to be secondary. Technique is an empty vessel. It has to be filled by a vision, an idea, a spirit, an emotion. It's a vessel that has to be filled. And that's what these bands brought to rock and roll, which by that time had become kind of an empty vessel of technique, polished production, not video shoots, is a pre-video era, but, costumed photo sessions and the like, And these bands put a sense of personal urgency back into the music, the sense that something was really at stake when they wrote these songs and went out to play them. It's exciting. I see Klaus Nomi as a very good example of the kind of performer whose unique talent could not comfortably or easily fit into any established scene or musical genre. His art to me was like, it was too transgressive, it was too weird, as many people would use the word. I think it was psychologically disturbing to some people, to some listeners. And I just think that his unique talent met a historical moment in the new wave, without which he might never have been heard, and without which that wave, that audience, would have been the poorer, without his contribution. And but that's a good example of like somebody who in this scene in which he found himself or into which he injected himself, the barriers were down. No one was quite sure what was acceptable and what wasn't, what was cool and what wasn't, what would be commercially viable 6 months, 2 years, 10 years from now, and what wouldn't. Instead, there's just the will to create, the will to perform. And there's an audience that seems to be up for it. You don't know, as the artist, how far they're going to follow you. They don't know where you're really taking them. Certainly the classical field, I myself had never had the slightest connection with it. And I'm sure I'm like most people who were populating, the new wave rock clubs of this period. Just really didn't know anything about about classical music, had perhaps never attended the opera or even listened to recordings. It was just a complete mystery. And it was, in a way, it was as much like it was like Robert Gordon reviving rockabilly, almost an equally like lost art form, something that most people associated with an archaic, bygone past. And this is what Klaus, of course, was doing for opera. He was really taking a form and turning it inside out and standing it on its head to make it a vehicle for his personal expression. It's a greater sense of curiosity, openness, to experimentation and to what, has been called the shock of the new. And that's what Klaus Nomi offered, shock of the new. I'm not one of those people who thinks that like artistic spontaneity and inspiration died, when I turned 40, or when Max's Kansas City closed, or when Stiff Records was sold to CBS or whatever the hell happened to Stiff Records. As we speak, somebody's out there trying to hone a vision, trying to express an original idea. Somebody's feeling something from inside that they're feeling a need, they're feeling an emptiness from inside that the dominant culture isn't giving them. Some future generation that's just over the rise, are they going to come forward and throw it back in the face of the dominant culture? I'm really not the guy in a position to say anymore. I'm really not. It's not for me to say. It's not for anybody to say until it happens. But as somebody who lived through it once, maybe more than once if you think about, considering that I was a young teenager at the rise of hippie, let me tell you something, the world turns upside down. You wake up in the morning and it's just not the same universe anymore. You really feel it inside. Something has changed and it can't go back to being the way that it was. The old role models of success and creativity, of rock stardom and what was like quality or great, so-called great rock music, they get overturned. And it can't mean anymore what it once did. Something else has come along with a new message and a new vitality. And anybody who gets to live through a moment like that in the history of their culture and their country is really lucky.
Well, like a lot of, probably all Klaus's fans, I was really devastated when he died, and it just seemed like the thing to do would be to resurrect him. So I built this figure. It's made out of painted wood, and I used a lot of different materials. I made a little scalp for him and threaded hair in, sort of strand by strand. He has sort of metal inserts for his eyes, for his pupils. I went to the fabric store and got yards and yards and yards of sequins and glued them onto his feet to make his shoes. I jointed absolutely everything I could think of. I jointed all the finger joints in his hand so he would sort of move or potentially could move any way he wanted, should he decide to. And after I built the whole thing, my father's an engineer, I decided it would be nice if he came to life, so it would be great if he would sit up and open his eyes. Well, it turned out resurrecting him was almost as difficult as doing the real thing, partly because I built him and then decided he needed to sit up. So there's a huge amount of weight on this end, and then where the lever has to pull on him, there isn't that much for them to tug on. So there's enormous counterweight under here to help him sit up. And we tried all kinds of different combinations of levers to get it to work. And for a long time, we'd sort of get him to go up 45 degrees and couldn't seem to get him to go the rest of the way. But after sort of seemed like maybe 20 rebuilds, we finally got him to go all the way up. There's just a little cylinder in the bottom that's filled with oil. And the cylinder is attached to a lever, which is then attached to some springs that go to the foot pedal. When you step on the foot pedal, you stretch the springs, and then the springs pull on the lever that pulls him up, and the speed is controlled by the fact that there's oil in the cylinder, so it sort of makes it, otherwise he would sit bolt upright, so it just keeps him, it just makes it very slow and kind of eerie. Well, I would have liked to have been able to make him get up and sing again, but I couldn't do that. It's the best I could do.
My main connection to Klaus is based on this tremendous irony that I told him in his voice studies that there was really no future in singing in falsetto, and to be realistic about that. And then I had this idea in the interim to form an opera company in which the soprano and mezzo roles were sung by gentlemen who had tremendous falsettos. And La Grande Scena became my company. And this enormous irony exists that here, over 20 years later, we're about to celebrate our 20th anniversary season in New York. I told Klaus that there was no future in singing in falsetto, which subsequently became my future. And at that time, I remember going to a concert at Carnegie Hall and seeing Klaus, who was now Klaus, in full Klaus drag, all in black, painted up. It was a concert, a recital really, of this aged soprano, Magda Olivero, whom everyone worshipped at that time, who has had amazing vocal longevity, sort of just stopped singing at 110. And this was about 1981. And I had just started to put together Grande Scena. And I saw Klaus, I was sitting in my seat, she was doing an encore. He was by then down the side aisle, standing, watching the encore, and just worshiping at the shrine. And I was aching to go up to him and say, you know, that thing I told you about not singing in your upper register, well, I've just formed an opera company where everyone does that. But I was sure he wouldn't remember me. He was by then, you know, a full-fledged celebrity, so I, being kind of shy, just resisted doing that. But I was dying to say that. I had heard a cassette of his Mon Coeur sur va te voir from Samson Delilah, and I just thought, I'd like to go up and say, well, anytime you'd like to sing Delilah, now you can, in my company.
Back in the 70s, I was managed by Michael Lang. If you remember, he did Woodstock. He was one of the guys who put on Woodstock. And he was managing me, and he was so hip to everything that was going on in New York City all the time, and as a matter of fact, the whole world. Told me about that he had heard lightning strikes by someone, and I thought, you know, and he said it wasn't me. And usually, when someone says that, it's like, you know, I have to trace it down, because not many people can do any of my songs that I've written, you know, because of the octave ranges. And so, and that was the first time that I'd heard of Klaus. And he was performing, and I can't remember the name of the club. It was up on the Upper West Side. I'm sure all of you know, but we went there that night, and I was blown away, because all of a sudden, you know, the show went on, and they wheeled Klaus out in this yellow ball gown. And I heard, and he did Lightning Strikes, you know, was his big number, and it was, I just absolutely did a number on my head, because, you know, I was used to traveling around with the American Bandstand bunch. You know, we were all, whether it be Brian Hyland, you know, Gene Pitney, Johnny Tillotson, Paul Anka, Frankie Avalon, and all of a sudden this little alien was singing Lightning Strikes, which really threw me. You know, I was knocked out with it, and I thought, I got to talk to this guy. Where's he coming from? Yeah. We were really excited about doing something together. There was no doubt about that. You know, so because you know we would started in just to sort of come down and have coffee together, and it ended up, you know, all afternoon, you know, a whole day, and then thing. I mean, I just had that feeling that he was from some other planet, you know, and that was my first feeling that I got from him. So I thought it would be interesting to write something that had to do with what I felt, which was like a space opera or something, you know. And I could have used a lot of the classical changes and some of the great changes instead of your typical 4 chords in rock and roll. But I could tell he could go there, you know. I mean, his choice of material, you know, after I listened to a lot of his stuff, you know, and then of course him picking Lightning Strikes, I thought, he'll be able to handle this, you know. And it was really, it inspired me. Well, you know, when you're young, I had I guess a high voice and then when my voice changed at like 12 years old, I acquired the low voice, but I never lost the high voice. And it was just, I thought everyone could sing like that, because my whole family sang. My mother and father and my sister, and we all sang. So I didn't think it was anything that unique, to be quite honest. But then as I got older, you know, and I could sing in the choir, and I could sing, you know, bass. He was trying to get me to go, he was the conductor, Mr. Cummings, and tried to get me to go to college and study music the proper way, as it used to be, you know. Of course, rock and roll was always pulling me into that kind of music, and I would have gone probably and studied classics and things like that. But when I would vocalize or something like that, he would always tell me that you can't sing that way. You got to stop singing that way, and you're going to lose your voice. By the time you're 20 or 21 years old. And here I am. I'm a little older than 21, and I still have my voice. And I still sing everything in the same key that I wrote the song. So, when I had the chance to record my very first record, everyone said, well, the disc jockeys, they get about 300 records every week, and they put the needle on, and it takes about 15 seconds. If they don't hear something in 15 seconds, they take it off, and that's the end of your record. You're never going to hear it again, So I thought, I got to get their attention. So that's when we hit, boom, the chord, and I had some trouble with my baby, with its tambourine, and that was like, what was going, they didn't know what was going on. The voice was different, and it was a sort of very stark, where I was singing in this falsetto. And then, of course, I went into the hook, cry, and it really got their attention. And that was the beginning of the stamp that was on the Lou Christie, that voice. So, well, when I write songs, I either visualize myself riding down Sunset Boulevard with the top down to create that feeling, or the feeling and something like on a roller coaster. When you going in a roller coaster, you go up, and by the time you hit the top of the hill, you're doing lightning strikes, and when you're shooting down the other side of the hill, on the roller coaster, it has that excitement, and that's what I felt he captured when he sang Lightning Strikes. But when I wrote songs for myself, I would always try to get that kind of feeling of just ecstasy, as you were going through the song. It would take it this way and that way, and you never know which way you were going, in the tunnel and out of the tunnel and back up and down.
Yeah, Bowie and Klaus on TV was three freaks in dresses, but it was suddenly, it suddenly went national. It suddenly got big. It suddenly wasn't in just a club anymore, and it gave a lot of people permission, or at least it gave me permission, a couple of other people. Hey, we could be freaks now. I was living up in the Times Square area, and I dyed my hair purple, and wore a shirt with a man's shirt with a tie, and a skirt with leotards and dance shoes. And I was on 38th Street. Danceteria was on 36th Street. I decided to walk to the club, and there were a lot of street gangs hanging around Times Square, and it was a pretty rough neighborhood. And I remember coming down the street and turning the corner, and there was a gang of 5 or 6 kids, ghetto kids, and they were kicking cars and making some noise, and there was definitely trouble. And when I walked up the block, and they walked up the block, and they stopped, and I stopped, and this tough street gang is here looking at this guy with purple hair and a skirt, and they crossed the street to avoid me.
So here's a letter sent to me by the Scottish Klaus Nomi Appreciation Society, care of Cafe Information Central in Greenock, Scotland, and sometime in 1984, so after Klaus has died. And it says, Dear Klaus Nomi Fan Club, we have recently started the Scottish Klaus Nomi Appreciation Society, but are struggling through lack of info, and we are hoping that you could help us in this area. Though we have a small membership at this time, we hope that it will grow in the not-too-distant future. This would be greatly enhanced by the info you would send us. We have off-scanned the British music press to no avail, as there has been little or no talk of Klaus since his unfortunate and much publicized demise. We have monthly meetings when we get together and listen to his records, watch those videos we have collected from such sources as Erg Music War and various clips from the Old Grey Whistle Test, and generally have a party time. Please water this flower in the wilderness by supplying us with any relevant facts, e.g. discography, and the means of joining your official fan club. Yours faithfully. And I love their adorable little graphic. And here is an October '84 letter, which is a fun, fast one. Dear Sirs, Klaus Nomi is bizarre. I must know more quickly. This is actually an American letter from somebody in Silver Spring, Maryland. It was actually always interesting to me the number of American letters I got, despite our lack of record deal here. All right, this is a letter from a young woman in Grenoble, and I gave you this letter?
No, your father gave it.
so I don't know when the date is. I don't know whom I am writing to, but I have to tell you how I love Klaus Nomi's voice. I can't believe I did not hear him before. I can't believe he is not more famous in France. I don't know anything of him, and I would like to know what he has done. Please can you send me a list of the records he has made? That's very important to me. I just have one record, Encore, and want to know everything he sang. By the way, did he sing in operas? If he did, please tell me which ones. I don't write very well, forgive me, but English is not my native language, and I have so much to ask, I have so much to tell, so many feelings when I heard him for the very first time. You know, when I am sad or when I don't believe in me anymore, I put this record on, and you can't imagine how much better I feel. Such a voice. Every time I discover something new in his voice and in myself too. By the way, I don't even know if he is still alive or not. Sorry, I really feel ashamed to admire somebody I don't even know. It seems unreal to me. That is the first time I show my admiration for somebody I've never seen before, for somebody I've never heard from before. To me, he looks like a stranger who came from somewhere else. He's not made to be a human being like everybody, like me, for instance. How lucky are the people who met him and who had the chance to be his friend. Maybe he is somebody who never loved anyone but himself, I don't know. But even if it is true, I will never believe it. When I heard his voice, I hear love. I am sure that beyond this wonderful voice is a wonderful man. Well, I feel stupid to write to somebody I don't know about somebody I know I love. I feel like a child in front of the Christmas tree and who knows Santa Claus does not exist, lying to himself, hoping for a miracle anyway. Thanks for having read my letter. That's a sweet letter. It's a very perceptive letter, I must say. You got to give this young woman a lot of credit. So, Florence, if you're out there, we'd like to hear from you again.
They're sort of vehicles to deliver a chapter in the mythos of Klaus. And they were made consciously as such. And to help invent the myth. I knew when I was writing them we were trying to invent a myth. Whether or not it would work is another question. So I went off in my little house on Grand Street on the Bowery and played my piano and came up with a few little songs. And I gathered this from the way he would talk about Kenny Scharf's paintings, the way he would talk about being an alien. I gathered it from, Keys of Life, him working on that little song. I just gathered it from a variety of things, and then I superimposed on it that it was this Bowie-esque Ziggy Stardust kind of vehicle that we could make as huge as we wanted to. And I thought it was very important to make the story be pretentious and big, but make it palatable by making the songs funny and catchy. But I did have this idea, it was all of Klaus's ideas filtered through what I thought he meant. I tried to be true to what his statement was, and I think his statement was basically, first he wanted to say, here we are living on the edge of this potential apocalypse. And it wasn't just an apocalypse of nuclear blast, it was more like an apocalypse of the soul. Punk was willfully not beautiful, was willfully looking into the bleak side of things, was willfully saying, isn't everything so horrible? And then our statement is going to be, fuck you, you fucking fuck this, fuck that, fuck it all, fuck a fucking brat, all that kind of stuff. And that was heralded as something really remarkable at the time. And so there was that kind of apocalypse of outlook. And then there was apocalypse of beauty not being accepted. You didn't search for beauty, you searched for ugliness. You didn't search for spirituality, you searched for truth. So that was, Total Eclipse was all of these things that were perceived as positive humanistic values were in eclipse. And then the Nomi song was, Here I Am. You may not be able to recognize me at first, and maybe I have to be so outlandish to get you to hear me. But here I am at the edge of this apocalypse, I'm with you. And then after the fall was who cares if all that stuff happens? Who cares if punk destroys culture? Who cares if disco idiot clones are dancing with poppers up their noses to forget everything? We want to remember and build. We have a different thing. So after everything else is gone, we're going to build this vision. And then Simple Man was kind of the message song, and the message was that old hippie message that you weren't allowed to have in punk, that the true message is just love, and it's so simple, which I have to say, at the end of Simple Man where he goes like, it's so simple. I totally stole that from a Cramps song where he says, sunglasses after dark, it's so simple. And I just thought it would be hilarious to have Klaus say this Cramps thing, but that was another one of my little jokes that sort of fell by the wayside. In the way that I had them steal the guitar solo from the Carpenters' Goodbye to Love, a big point of reference for me at the time.
In which song?
In Goodbye to Love, the single that destroyed the Carpenters' career, they have a huge, like, mega rock guitar solo in the outro that's just beautiful. And so I tried to get Robert Maché to play that solo at the end of Simple Man. That was my, Klaus, the Carpenters, the Cramps, it all comes together. The thing that Klaus brought to the entire project was his knowledge of classical music and his knowledge of what were to me, and I am highly musically uneducated, but to me were relatively obscure choices to sing but to my uneducated ear, they were incredibly beautiful. The aria from Samson and Delilah, which I've subsequently went and bought recordings of because I loved his rendition of it so much, and he does it different than they do it. His way of doing it is much more beautiful, and I don't know that it's this thing about being a boy singing it, or I don't know what it is, but there's something innocent and sensitive and moving and ethereal about his reading that I wouldn't even have known was there had I not gone out and bought the recorded material. And then I don't know anything about Purcell. I knew he was early, but the Cold Song and Wayward Sisters to me are both the immediate emotional impact to me. But the thing he brought to it was the thing that I couldn't supply, which was that legitimate, ghostly, ethereal beauty. I could bring the clever and the camp and the pop savvy, and he could take it to the next level.
Maybe I'm romanticizing it, as people tend to do about their time in their 20s, but everybody was here to be an artist. Not so much a star, but just to be an artist and really excel at whatever art form they chose, whether it was fashion or music or performing or art. People were very dedicated to honing that identity for themselves, and there was a true alternative community that had its own newspaper, its own TV shows, its own clubs, its own hangouts, and all of that was contained in downtown. We did not need the validation of the world that existed north of 14th Street.
Who said the East Village was going to be a cool place to move? It wasn't supposed to be. It was supposed to be the place that nobody wanted, wasn't it? That's why we were there. That's why we would go there. That's why we were sleeping there. It was because it was the last place left. There wasn't anything there, and it was perfect.
But I just think some of the happiest days of my life were during that time, because I never was thinking about money. No, things didn't seem to cost very much, and the things that I wanted were free. I got all my clothes from thrift stores. I would come back with bags of stuff and only having spent maybe at the most $20. Totally cool outfits. And you would, spend your day getting your outfit together and your night. Not just hanging out at clubs, but also creating in those clubs, so that people would make these events where everyone was asked to participate and be an artist. Suddenly somebody wanted you to be in their band, and you'd never played an instrument before, but you learned 3 chords and you were in a band. Or you had never thought that you could be a model, but, so-and-so was a fashion designer and they needed models, so boom, you were on stage at the Mud Club modeling the fashions, and it was like that every night.
I think that we didn't have the commercial support from the media that the young people have today. We felt the sense of importance. We felt that we might have been the last young people to come along, or we felt like this is to be the last generation, perhaps. So we were self-conscious on that level, but we didn't have any help. I guess I should just come out and say it. We didn't have MTV. There was nothing to teach us how to dress or to tell us how to dance or how to act or how to look. I think we just started to express ourselves in a way that was so spontaneous, in a way unrehearsed, certainly uncommercial. And it was, for the moment, totally ours, and it hadn't been co-opted.
You could get up on stage and basically do anything, and everybody was happy to see you. And the things that went on at CBGB's were just nuts, you know, some of the acts. And the Mud Club is famous for this. Yeah, it was like a hotbed of creativity, trying to make something happen with no means whatsoever. And everybody would pitch in and everything would be cool. And everybody was kind of a little bit self-consciously crazy too, you know. But anything, not to be slick, not to be disco, not to be middle of the road. And to be like not really in America.
And when I first moved to the East Village, I think it was in 1973. So that was probably about a year before Klaus came. And I got this apartment on 4th Street and Avenue A. And at the time, everybody thought I was completely out of my mind to live there. Even people my age, they just thought, like, you're crazy. This is a horrible neighborhood. You're going to get killed. You know, it's just awful. This is the St. Mark's Cinema. I never remember a time when this wasn't there, except when they tore it down and it turned it into the Gap. You could go there for $1 and see 3 movies. It was really the place to go when the heat was off in your apartment. And I saw a lot of movies because I just had to be somewhere warm. I think this was the first record store I ever remember where I started noticing the first sort of independently produced records. You know, there was a point at which the bands at that time realized that, you know, for a few $100s you could price your own record, and suddenly there was just this explosion of records all over the place, and they would, every week or every day, they would paste the new single that had just come out in the door, and the door was like full of all these singles. And I think this is the first time I ever saw the B-52 single and the Elvis Costello, At the time, there were a number of places to buy used books around the neighborhood. This is where I used to go shopping for books and records. The guy who owned this store, his name was Max. I don't think I ever knew his last name. And he had a great selection of books and had a fabulous selection of records. And here's where I bought a lot of jazz records and a lot of really interesting stuff from the 50s and early 60s. You know, you could get it for like $1. And I remember I used to see Patti Smith would come in there all the time and buy books and stuff. The St. Mark's Bar and Grill was probably a holdover from, you know, some bygone era, and it also gradually got taken over by the punks. And this had a really great jukebox, and this became like a really popular hangout and sort of transcended the whole local neighborhood aspect of it when the Rolling Stones came in and shot one of their music videos there. This is Gem Spa. This was really like a big East Village sort of landmark thing, and it was something that's probably been here since the old days of the Jewish Lower East Side. And this is the place where you could go to get like an egg cream and buy cigarettes or magazines at like 3 in the morning. And there's a famous cover of the New York Dolls record where they're all hanging out in front of the Gem Spa. This was definitely like a big thing if you were into like punk kind of clothing. And this was run by Tish and Snooki, who were in a band called the Sick Fucks, and they also performed in the vaudeville show. And they're now the international distributors of Crazy Color, which is what people use to dye their hair pink and blue and orange and whatever. And the clear plastic raincoat that Klaus wore in the vaudeville show was bought at Manic Panic. And recently I found out there's a guy named Howie Pyro who was sort of a neighborhood character, and apparently he stole that cloak from his mother. I guess that was her raincoat. And he sold it to Tish and Snooki at Manic Panic, and that's where Klaus got it. Variety theater, actually it's called Variety Photoplays. I mean, it was the cheapest porno theater I have ever seen in my life. The porno movies there were so bad. I mean, people didn't even take their clothes off when they had sex. They would just like lay on top of each other and move around. But at a certain point, they started showing like repertory cinema. You know, they would show foreign movies, weird cult movies, and it was every day it would change, and they would show like The Hunchback of Notre Dame with Land of a Thousand Nudes. Odessa was really the place as far as I was concerned, and it was really very much a neighborhood place that got taken over by punks. This whole mixing of the new wave and the punk with the old world came when I saw some punk girl who got a job as a waitress at the Odessa. It was just such a cool thing to see this sort of mix of the neighborhood, you know, the little punkette girl and these sort of overweight, beefy Polish women.
Klaus had to have, if he were, he had to be the sun and the planets had to be spinning around him, to sort of create the whole Nomi entourage vibe thing, So they became like a family. They were like a family that had been placed here from outer space in the East Village. I mean, it was that whole thing. I mean, it's coming from the Club 57 era, where you just get together and it's like, come on, kids, let's put on a show. And, Nomi's show, was very distinctive. Well, Adrian came from like a real firm sort of kind of artistic mime background from Chicago. And he was definitely more into dance and mime. It seemed like he had studied it, or he had a great passion for it, and he brought that to the show. He was very, very good with his hands. He was great with building stuff and cutting stuff out and making something out of nothing. And so yeah, a lot of the artistic energy came from Adrian. And he also had a really cool look. Janice came absolutely out of nowhere. We went to a party down in Soho, I think on Broome Street, and at someone's loft, and she was just sitting there. And she had some hooded, futuristic outfit on. And immediately, the moment Klaus saw her, he went, "Oh my God, it's little sis," And then Joy and I were just like, "Oh my God, you're the sister of Nomi," to see someone that looked so much like Klaus. And she had a very pure, high voice. She was great at picking up, the whole mime thing, sort of falling in line with Adrian and Joey. But mostly it was just her style. I think she just brought this great female counterpart to Klaus. Well, Joey was totally Klaus's muse, I mean, Joey was more, he came from the groundlings and improvisational theater and singing, like major singing background. So, God, Joey's whole impact on the whole thing is huge as far as, the vocals and the encouragement. Definitely the fashion, the fashion stuff. Joey has an amazing, sense of style and fashion, that sort of thing. Joey was just very eager. Joey wanted to, he wanted to go with Klaus, into Nomi land, and I think that both of them just would have done anything to make that happen.
Klaus is an interesting guy. Klaus was very firm about his ideas. He knew what he wanted, but at the same time, he was kind of like a girl waiting for somebody to ask him to dance. He was sort of, well, I don't know what to do with myself, tell me what to do. So if you came up with a strong idea and presented it to him, said, this is what you're going to do today, he was fine. He was great with it, and he'd go off with it. Klaus was getting music from several sources. He had Manny was working alone with his synthesizers, and he was coming up with very sort of electronic approach to his stuff. Christian is a singer-songwriter, so his approach was more thematic stories that would tie together into some kind of overall concept. George and I were working on something that we called the space opera, and we were being more like graphic artists about it. What we were doing was we were just throwing tapes out, and just whatever worked, we'd keep, and we'd stitch the whole thing together. And we thought that we'd have something really spacey and artsy at the end of that. In a way, it's a good thing we never got to that point, because all three of us would have collided, because we all had three very different viewpoints of how this should be. Ron, on the other hand, saw him being much more of a revival act, and he was responsible for the Elvis Presley tune and the Leslie Gore. And he wanted to see Klaus do more standards, more old favorites. So everybody had a different concept of what this was supposed to be. This is a discussion that we were having all the time. Manny really wanted Klaus to be as hip and as cool and as downtown and as underground as he could be, and just take risks and do wild things, which I thought absolutely he should. That's great. Christian, I think, saw this more as a show, as something that could be developed into a Broadway-style show or or a movie or something that had thematic parts to it, that was possibly an opera, something in that direction. I think Ron and I were much more opportunistic. We saw him as Wayne Newton. We saw him setting up in Las Vegas and having just a Siegfried and Roy kind of show with everything happening. So everyone had a different vision on what he should be. And then there's the question of, well, are you selling out? Well, who are you catering to? Are you selling out if you're trying to reach the largest number of people? Are you selling out if you're going in one direction and not going in another? Is it uncool to be popular? If you hit too big, does that mean you're going to crash as hard as you hit? These were all things that we discuss and later realized we had absolutely no control over.
This is Klaus's Aunt Trudy's apartment, actually. I guess that's what you would call it. This is what we built for the movie because she was very shy in front of the camera and she didn't want to actually appear in the movie. So in order to solve that problem, I called a friend of mine who was a painter, Blaise Lawless, and he built this actually little dollhouse reconstruction of her apartment. If you look here at the table, you can see her little coffee set. Her Italian espresso coffee maker is actually a metal pencil sharpener. The cups and the saucers are the tops of tubes of paint. The napkins are just little pieces of cardboard. The little pieces of cake are little slices of corrugated cardboard. The tablecloth is the paper that you wrap butter in. That's the inside of the paper, and it's just folded onto a cardboard table that Blaise made. Klaus's aunt there, that's a little doll that Blaise made from a picture that she sent us of herself. We just made a laser blow-up of the picture and pasted it on a piece of cardboard, and it's a blouse from a Barbie doll. The shawl is from a pair of Blaise's old socks. This is a piece of wrapping paper that has this great leopard design, and that's the dress that she wore when I first met her. And oddly enough, when I first met Joey Arias, he was wearing a shirt, sort of a calypso shirt, that was that same leopard material. And then soon afterwards, when I met her, she was wearing the skirt that matched his shirt. So I thought that, was really a sign of how hip she was. And over here is her television set. And this is just a cardboard box with a photograph of a fogged picture just pasted on top of it. And then we matted in Klaus into the TV so she could be watching Klaus on TV. Blaise was like an incredible painter, and he duplicated all the paintings that she had in her apartment. He actually repainted them all in miniature. And those are real hand-painted pictures that are hanging on the walls. So the flowers here in the back, those are actually just some matches gathered together in the top of a lipstick container. Over here is a picture of Klaus. That's really just a little frame that Blaise made, and I made Xerox reductions of some pictures of Klaus that I had, and we made several different variations so we could change them. In the back is the wallpaper, and to make the pattern of the wallpaper, actually I took the text of what she's saying and printed it out on a piece of paper, and we slid it into strips and then made colored laser copies of it. And Blaise pasted these onto the wall, and that makes the stripes of the wallpaper. So if you look really closely, you can actually see the text of what she's saying. And my favorite piece is the slide projector. This is basically a matchbox with the top of a tube of glue just glued onto the front of it and two little screws underneath that hold it up. And you can see she has a little remote control for that as well. The other set that we had for Klaus's aunt was the garden from the house where she used to live when Klaus was a little boy. And she told us where the house was, and Blaise and I tried to go over there and just take a look at the real garden, but nobody was home when we went there. So we never got to see it, and we just kind of made it up. And Blaise just made the garden walls out of cardboard and painted all that and masonry work on it and the grain of the wood on the door. And then the lawn is a piece of AstroTurf. And what's really cool is the sort of these autumn leaves that are sprinkled there around the lawn. Those are just chili flakes. The lawn ornament, that's actually the top of a flashlight with a little glass ball on it. And there's a little potted plant, and what that is a wooden top of a scrub brush that Blaise just painted the bristles green. And over here are some garden implements that he made just out of pieces of paper and some sticks, and then there's a little piece of rubber tubing for the hose. And we made the sunset there just with various lights on 3 different dimmers, and I would sort of count down the sunset, and we would slowly turn the dimmers down to sort of make the sunset look as real as it possibly could.